So my area is really comparative political economy and international political economy. So my research on China's Belt and Road Initiative was very much rooted in this theoretical backgrounds on looking at domestic politics and looking at the domestic process of economic policies, either regional or international economic policies. So as I also do a lot of field research in China, and I remember before the BRI's launch, the Chinese policy networks, they faced lots of problems, crises, and geostrategically, the Chinese failed. They couldn't react to America's pivot to Asia. So the security tensions in the maritime domain was very tense, and yet the Chinese didn't have a good way to counter that. And diplomatically, they also felt that there was lots of problems between China and its neighbors, despite economic exchange and investments was rising. So they felt that on the diplomatic front, it was failing, but most difficult one was domestic. So the Chinese economy was slowing down, and worse, the industrial overcapacity was widely spread. So it's like 80% of industry in China was ranging from 30 to 50% in overcapacity, and to the Chinese Beijing and the local governments, they were all struggling with how to shore up the economy so that they don't have to lay off too many workers. So I think those were really critical moments for the Chinese leadership. And they also have different proposals that to address each of these challenges. China goes west as a strategic reorientation to counter the pivot to Asia, and then the diplomatically, the argument for infrastructure diplomacy was proposed. So in my book, I talk about in the economic domain, they were advocating for Chinese Marshall Plan. Right? So to invest overseas and expand external market and demand to relieve the pressure inside China. Right? But these very good ideas available in the policy world communities, like the bureaucracy and the associated think tanks, but none of them really could able to implement it, because the Chinese bureaucracy and the policy communities were set up by functions, right? And yet all these proposals would require actors with actual resources and autonomy to implement. And now these bureaucracies have power over the actual implementers in China, and that power belongs to the leadership. So at this time, then the President Xi was visiting in Indonesia and Kazakhstan. So he made the two announcements on the BRI. And I was in this process of doing research in China. And once he made the announcements, and then the bureaucracies and their leading think tank scholars momentarily, they just seized the opportunity and really begin to promote their pre-existing ideas. And so quickly, this economic corridors proposal came out, the 5 connectivities, mutual connectivities, ideas came out, and the kinds of Chinese Marshall Plan were really revived. So I think the leader then saw that suddenly his proposals got so much support, and he took a lot of ownership and interest in the strategy again. And so I in the book, so the first stage of research, I really want to look at this dynamics, how facing crises and then the leadership intervention and mobilizing the whole state bureaucracy into doing something in the name of the BRI. And to me, as a China scholar, when I observe that process, I know this is critical, because this is not the first time, because the Chinese periodically face this state paralysis and face challenges, economic troubles, and then the political leadership typically intervene, and with major rhetorically strategic rhetoric, and then mobilizing local governments and state companies to implement. And to China, this has been its way of overcoming periodic challenges and slowdown and crises, and then mobilizing the state into action. Right? So I thought the BRI was really significant. So I started to conduct how these bureaucracies and then local governments and companies implement them in their own jurisdictions. And just by mapping out their projects, I feel it's really significant. And then from outside, in the foreign observers, and they thought this, in the beginning, they thought this BRI was nothing, right? Because it was very hollow and was very imprecise. There were lots of noise, but there were very little substance. So if you recall, the US actually was very afraid of the AIIB, right? So they lobbied against AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I remember my first piece for foreign policy, I argued for the importance of the Silk Road, the new Silk Road strategy, and the editor almost decided not to publish it because he thought the main thing is TPP. It shouldn't be about the BRI. And the events that I organized at BU, all the other panelists were talking about AIIB, and I kept telling them, and so the AIIB is a small game. The bigger game China was playing was a BRI. But again, as a China domestic scholar, then you can see why the BRI would be more significant for China, because it appeals to the major interest groups. It appeals to the critical players that matter to the leadership and to matter on the projects and matter to the outcome. But Western scholars, when they study foreign relations or international strategies, they have the institution or the policy as a or budget, right? So procedure. These as assessments, and when you look at these institutions or budget or mechanism procedure, and then BRI didn't have any. Right? So I think that there was the first time, as I was exchanging with international relations specialists, I realized there's wide gulf in understanding the Chinese way, what's important strategy and what's minor pursuit on the side. And so that was the first phase. I find my finding to be very different from the international relations observers. And then the Chinese held the first BRI summit in 2017, and I knew it was just for mobilization, for coming out party, and yet the foreign observers, when they look at the the kind of grander rhetoric, the grander staging and the pageantry employed in Beijing, they thought this is really major grand strategy by China, promoted by this ambitious leader to achieve China's dominance, strategically pursuing China's interests and power. And so so the book kind of, lots of the efforts were trying to present how local governments and how companies seize the moment and use the word BRI, but primarily implementing their pre-existing infrastructure and programs, or layer on the same name on existing ideas. And lots of them do not have the only have very minimum relationship with the kinds of external expansion idea. Rather, it's pursuing much short-term commercial motivations, like keeping their losing industry, keeping the employment, and restarting certain infrastructure projects. So this is not coordinated strategic strategy as in international relations theory. This is a political mobilization, and that allowed Chinese state-owned companies and local governments and other business to re-stimulate their economy. And so the economic angle was quite important. So I then use this framework, state-mobilized globalization, to kind of integrate the phenomena of BRI. And same thing goes to the older grand strategy in China, the Western Development Program, and then the China Goes Out strategy, both started around the 2000. And so this the phenomena really shows that it was a crisis-driven. It's not like strategically designed, and so the Chinese leadership they react to address fundamental economic pressures and downward pressure in particular, and then their intervention was limited at the strategic rhetoric level, and the kinds of rhetoric or the ambition and the power of the leader would be used by supranational actors and local governments, as well as state-owned companies, to promote their own agenda. It sounds bad, but it did help China stabilize or sustain economic growth, and while maintaining social stability in the last 20 years at least. But it's a so I call it a very confusing framework. The Chinese kind of understood it intuitively, but it's very confusing to others, and it's definitely in mismatch with a kind of transparency or institutional expectation from outside China. And so on the other hand, it does create a significant moral hazard problems, because these investors are both bureaucrats and capitalists. Right? So sometimes they are extremely risk averse. Other times they can be extremely risky. Right? So, but to deal with this kind of capital, I feel like we have to understand the Chinese capitalism more. And so that make up the book project.
Very fascinating. And you very nicely summarize, and looking forward to reading the follow-up so from your book too. And there are lots of overlaps with the development stages of Western capitalism as well, with surplus capital and so on. Um, and moving forward, in terms of your participation in the multipolarity working group,
Mhm.
what was your main motivation, and what are the type of questions that you would like to explore or collaborate with others in the working
Yeah,
group?
yeah, that's right. So the article that I situate in the context of this working group is from is a kind of follow up from the book's research on the BRI, and this time, so I take a step back, right, assuming that the BRI will be China's grand strategy, right? Because there's no other way. And so if we assume this is China's grand strategy, and this is also the grand strategy that has been perceived and treated as such by the United States and other countries as well. So what does this phenomena, the BRI phenomena, the computation surrounding BRI, tell us about a strategic competition or international relation theory as it's ongoing, right? So so the book, the article, then I first kind of evaluated these popular perspectives, and both by scholars and by more popular policy writers, and I find there are lots of them. The China foreign policy field, in particular, U.S.-China relation is a booming field, and there are lots of publications. So I kind of grouped them into three groups. So the first group I use Thucydides' trap to describe them, but this basically refers to the sets of arguments, discourses, observations that underscore the structural competition. And so you have a great power, then you have a rising power, and this power shift creates uncertainty, mistrust, and confusion, and perhaps missteps between them, right? So and that really gets to the traditional realism or neorealism literature a lot. In the second group, I use a clash of civilization to describe them, but it's really covers constructivism and liberalism, neoliberalism. So basically, I think the China-US competition, because they are not just in power, they also differ in culture, in behavior, and in tradition, and in political ideology. So it makes it very complex, and so many discourses and focus on this clash. It's institution, it's ideology, it's also value, it's also behavioral confusion. So this kind of capture a lot of this literature. And then the third groups, I think, most of the China scholars based in China would belong to the third group. So it's I call it a divided peace. So the idea is they argue either from a power perspective that China and US, right, they have a power balance that both of them cannot take each other out, right? So they have to coexist. And interest-wise, their fundamental interests are not really clashing. And so they have major differences, but their core interests actually are not irreconcilable. Right? So and then the norms. So the China talks about developmental peace, and so in China's external pursuit, the idea is developmental peace. And so let China pursue its developmental peace, and U.S. can pursue its democratic peace. And the last one is by more or less the President Xi Jinping himself. So the great power relationship, and his idea is just coexist, and I don't interfere in your country, you don't interfere with in my country. And so they all talk about the separation, and so interest wise, power wise, cultural wise, idea wise, in just separation to maintain peace. And so I find that these kind of if we apply the whole process of BRI from its origin to its formulation and implementation, so how these popular frameworks are tested with the BRI process, and I find that each of them seem to have caught some aspects of the BRI as in the context U.S.-China competition, but not all. For example, BRI was motivated by the TPP. And so I have, my book starts with the TPP. I have a prior, before the book, I have article that looking at how China sees TPP and how BRI came as a counter challenge to the TPP. Right? And the TPP was announced as a strategy targeting at China, right? So it's very clear, say, either convert China, make China like us, or contain China. And it was seen as very scary to China. In fact, China was much more relaxed with a pivot to Asia than the TPP. And that also indicates that China's foreign policy is not strategic military foreign policy. It's a much more developmental and overarching foreign policy. And the TPP creates a kind of economic globalization, regional balancing that scares China more than the pivot to Asia that's narrowly defined with alliance and a military strategy. So TPP really creates a big shockwave in China. But the Chinese response is very interesting. They did not rejected outright. So that resulted in extensive research among Chinese think tanks and the bureaucracies. So they look at how China could join, if not join, how to overcome or offset the consequence. And then the third option is looking for alternative, right? So the BRI did come out in this background as an alternative, but not to fight TPP, but give China a bit more space in the diplomatic realm, right? So I feel that kind of response from China to TPP, that BRI's response to TPP is really not as confrontational as we would expect from a great power rivalry perspective. And then once BRI came, and then in particular, US abandoned TPP, and then the US response to the BRI was also quite surprising, right? So we have two groups. One was by this multilateral economists or professionals or development specialists. So they study BRI and they try to raise the costs and risk and shortcomings on the implementation side. And then the strategists then used alliance and relied on regional balancing. So it's the free and open Indian Pacific strategy. And so we see that it clearly has a kind of strategic structural competition, institutional competition, but in the end, it's also helping engaging, right? It's really seriously engaging the projects conducted by the BRI, and in particular, when we go back to the Chinese response to the U.S. Suppression, you'll find the Chinese took in the development criticism and try to address those criticism, and in dealing with or countering the FOIP framework, then China reassessed its regional and bilateral policies with the members of FOIP, and so and trying to offset this counterbalancing effect. Right? But again, I feel like it's really not the kinds of intensified bilateral competition as the prevalent perspectives portray. And then when COVID occurred, I feel like COVID presented a natural test for whether divided peace would work, and because now the two countries actually were divided, and the scholars could not exchange. Think tank could not talk to each other, and the society was separated. And when the two countries were divided, and we saw that the kind of strategic competition, and particularly the cultural animosity, rose immensely. So my point is, actually, the divided peace doesn't work. So the COVID really tested that. But I present this as kind of a current age great power competition, and I think it's so I call it a complex competition, and so that has that involves policy actors in both countries that were not traditionally grand strategists, not militarists. They have military and strategists, but they are broader, and and also a lot of them came from the third countries. For example, in the FOIP or the TPP. Then the Japanese, the Australians, and they play much bigger roles in terms of stabilizing the relationship than the traditional bipolar perspectives would indicate. So this I am kind of left with that.